Ladies, if we could get started with our program. I'd like to introduce Liz Coffey, who has done just an excellent job putting together our luncheon programs this year. Thank you so much, Liz.
My pleasure.
And she will introduce our speaker.
Before I introduce Luann, I would like to thank the ladies in the kitchen. Yes. Particularly Amanda. Her co-chair could not be here today, but they've done an excellent job on preparing our food with the help of Bailey's mostly, so we can always count on that. I have the pleasure today of introducing one of the outstanding among many, many women in our parish, Luann Fortune. Luann has such a long list of accomplishments and things on her, what do you call these things? Resume. CD. Whatever. Shows how long I've been on it. But anyway, particularly I'll just say, I just asked for a PhD up here in what an LMT is, a licensed massage therapist in Brisbane. When my back hurts, I should think of her. She's on the faculty and the specialization coordinator for mindful leadership in healthcare at Saybrook University College of say that word for me. Integrative medicine and health sciences. See, when you get nervous, you can't speak. In addition to teaching, Luann is the program coordinator in the instructional design, and she supervises doctorate students in research. This is the end of the semester, so after Luann has talked to us, she has to dash off and meet with some students online. So, let's welcome Luann.
And this works, right?
Yeah.
How about that? Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all and to share the work that I do. And I do like to walk around. If you can't hear me at any point because I dropped my mic too low, give your hand up. I'm going to work from PowerPoint slides too. So rather than make you watch the screen, sometimes I distract and help you watch me. So I'm really glad to be here today. This is a topic that I talk on a lot. It has to do with what does it mean to be healthy. And preparing this talk today, I was able to look at it from a different perspective. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But first of all, what I'd like to do, Liz did such a good job of introducing me. We don't need to hear more about me. So what I'd like to do first of all is hear a little bit more about you. How many of you have been in the healthcare industry or in some way healthcare practitioners? If you can just raise your hand. Okay, good. That helps me. How many are educators or have served as educators? Okay, thanks for that, because it gives me a chance to see what the perspective is in the room. And some of you may think this is a little unusual, but the very next thing I'd like to ask you to do is to engage in a moment of centering. What I mean by that is throughout the talk today, I'm going to speak about how important awareness is. So I'd just like you to take a moment of awareness. First of all, maybe while you're still chomping on the last bit of your cookie or sipping on your iced tea, to center yourself. And what that means for me is I just get my eyes closed for a second and settle into my seat. So this is going to sound a little bit strange maybe, and if you don't want to close your eyes, that's okay too. You can gaze down at your tablecloth. And in the next moment, focus on your breathing. Breathing in, pausing and breathing out. And what you might notice is that lots of thoughts are coming up. The thoughts about where you've come from earlier in the day, the thoughts about where you're going to go to next. And just notice them And see if you can bring your focus back to your breathing. And as you breathe in and breathe out, you might notice that you can only breathe in the present moment. So if during our time today you find yourself called to all the places that you've come from and the places that you're going to, see if you can bring yourself back to your breath. And then I'd invite you to give your full attention to the time that you're here. Take one more generous breath in, and then let it go. And when you're ready, open your eyes and join me. So what I wanted to talk to you about today had to do with sources of health, but also from a uniquely women's perspective. And this could mean something different depending upon where you're thinking about your womanness and all of this. But this was a wonderful opportunity for me too, because the model is based on the wellness wheel, which has come out of positive psychology. It's been with us for several decades. As Liz mentioned, I'm a scholar, I'm also a researcher, but I've been a practitioner too, and I still keep up my massage license. And one of the things that calls to me about this is it's an integrated model, meaning that it calls on many different places. So this gave me a chance today talking to you to go back into the library, back to the literature, and see what is the latest research we have on the sources of health that are unique to women. So over the last weekend, I went back into the library and I checked on some of the latest data, and that's some of the information I'm going to be sharing with you today. There is an area that comes out of social science right now that's called intersectionality. It's become very popular in the media, and it crosses over many different disciplines. So it's evolved to encompass the idea that we have multiple identities. So I want to recognize, first of all, that although most of us in this room identify as female, or female as birth, we also have different socioeconomic backgrounds. We together are of the same religious affiliation, but the data that we're looking at does not necessarily apply to all women who are Episcopal. Sexual orientation also has a factor in some of the information that I'm going to be sharing with you, as well as gender identity, education. And if you are part of a multiple minority, in other words, if you are of a different race or a different gender orientation, some of this information might not apply the same way. So everything I'm going to be sharing with you, I encourage you to take a sense of how it might apply to you personally. This is a very personal talk. And what am I going to be talking about? Well, first of all, what is health and wellness? I work for a university that started out as the Institute of Humanistic Psychology. And that came up at a time when the trend in psychology and teaching it as a discipline was very oriented toward experimental work. How many of you have heard of B.F. Skinner? And he ran rats around little mazes and did experiments with his own children too, for heaven's sakes. But one of the pushbacks from the humanistic psychologists, and you may have heard of names like Abraham Maslow or Carl Rogers, was the idea that behavior alone, looking at behavior, was not enough to define us as whole human beings. And that actually we had the capacity that was inherent or innate in all of us to increasingly become better versions of ourselves. Well, this has a good deal of appeal to me because it also intersects with a very common way about thinking of health and wellness right now. So in my growing up, I was raised to think that health was something you enjoyed. What the humanistic perspective says is that health is also something that we cultivate. And that only about 20% of our health and well-being comes from seeing your healthcare practitioner. The other 80% of it comes from your community, from your behavior, from things that we all have individual control and empowerment over. So there is a good deal of self-efficacy involved in the model that I'm going to share with you. What the model says is that there are various sources of health. And in this particular picture, which is a little bit hard to see probably in the back of the room, there are 7 different sources. I worked up this model with one of my graduates, and she's since gone on to do some very wonderful, impressive work. And we looked at it from various perspectives and said, okay, we're going to recognize, first of all, that deconstructing the sources of health is just for conversational purposes. But here, today, we're having a conversation about health. So I'm going to deconstruct our sources into 7 different buckets. And I'm going to talk about them in each of their progressive areas, recognizing that they intersect. Because in your breathing in and breathing out, you saw for yourself that your mind is connected to your body, and the rest flows out of that. So I want to first of all start with the body, because we think about our biology as being one of the first sources of health. And there are 3 things about our body that we can do to improve our optimal health and wellness. They have to do with diet, they have to do with movement, and they have to do with sleep. So these 3 factors are 3 of the most important things any of us can do throughout our entire life cycle, from the time that we are taking our first breath to our very last, to encourage our optimal health and wellness throughout the entirety of our lives. So the quantity and the quality of our diet impacts our movement and our sleep. Our sleep impacts our movement and how we eat. Our movement impacts our eating and sleeping. And we can do things that are very simple to help improve and optimize that all the way through our lives within wherever we are at that particular moment. Because doing your best does not necessarily mean doing the same thing that I'm doing or that anybody else in the room is doing. It's what your own personal best is. Some very simple things that show up in the literature over and over again have to do with moving your spine. So wherever you're sitting right now, I'd encourage you to see if you can even find where your spine is and see if you can move it back and forth a little bit. That wiggling around we do when we're sitting in chairs too long, it's our body's way of saying, you know, I think I just need to move the spine over a little bit. The other thing is to stand whenever we can. And there's some very interesting evidence about that. I'll show it on the next slide. Exercise clearly is one, but what's exercise for one might be very different than for another. Food as medicine is a whole movement, and what is good for me may not be good for you, but there are foods that do encourage better health and wellness, especially at different times in our lives. Healthy sleep habits and breath work. The very act of breathing fully every time we can. Movement. So movement helps our brain power. It helps our mind, it helps our spirit. And there is something that became very popular a few years ago. Sitting is the new smoking. And based on this data, which got a lot of attention in the popular press, the idea was that sitting 5 hours per day, I'm guilty of that, I work at a computer all day long, is 5 years less in my life expectancy overall. So I got myself a standing desk. I sit on a yoga ball when I'm working at my desk. And I also try to follow the OSHA rule, which is that every 50 minutes, get up and move around, go get yourself a glass of water, move around, go pet the dog, do something different, because the data shows that can reduce your hypertension by 50%, diabetes risk by 30%, your chance of stroke by 27%, and even certain cancers by up to 25%. Now, how do women factor in this? So here is the interesting piece about this. What we started to realize several decades ago is that a lot of the studies that were coming out, even of our top medical research facilities, were being done on white males. They weren't taking into consideration how women and women's bodies might be experiencing things differently. And women's bodies are different. So something we've seen globally for a long time is that women live longer. And this doesn't depend if you are, it doesn't matter if you're here or in another continent, if you're in a village or a rural area, if you're living in an urban location, but there is a shift. It can be anywhere from 1 year different to 5 year difference. Women live longer than men. Part of that occurs all the way from infancy. Girl babies survive longer and better through their first year. They're not quite sure exactly why that is, by the way, but they have measured some cases of famine, even historically, and they've shown that women do better even under severe circumstances. They've also noticed that in the last 20 years, the variance is shrinking. Good news, bad news. We wanted more equality, we wanted more visibility in the workplace, we wanted higher pressure jobs, and we got some of those. And what this points to is the incredible influence of stress. And it's not just any stress, workplace stress, and it's gotten a lot of attention over the last 2 years in particular. I've never seen so much research on burnout, emotional exhaustion, moral injury in the workplace as I have in the last 2 years since the pandemic. How does this affect us? It's something called the Psychoneuro Immunological system. It's the core of how mind and body are connected. So, to bring it back to my point, women now have more authority in the workplace, but they're in workplaces where they may not be the ultimate authority. So it is not just a matter of stress, because we all have stress, we all need stress. It's part of our evolutionary biology and it continues us moving forward. It's a workplace stress that appears to be key. In particular, workplace stress where you don't have the autonomy to make decisions. So, the variance is shrinking. The change between men and women in longevity is attributed to societal factors, but let us not discount basic biology. Women have different hormone ratios, and that is important. All right, estrogens. Estrogens, which we've all enjoyed, including the men in the room, have enjoyed some estrogens. They are anti-inflammatory and they are immune enhancing. And in addition, there's a possible genetic advantage to having 2 X chromosomes instead of Y. There's a whole presentation I could do for you on this, but it does have to do with being less susceptible to things where there is a genetic influence on an expression of an illness or a disorder or a condition that you might have inherited. Has anybody heard the word epigenesis? Epigenic, okay, good. So epigenic means that we have a predilection to something, but it may or may not be expressed for us. And epigenesis is getting more and more attention. There's also the other side. So guys, testosterone is an immune suppressor. And testosterone also is linked to other things that are not good for health and longevity, in particular, risk-taking. So this is back to basic evolutionary biology. Women were meant to be the tenders of the fire, and men were to be out gathering, possibly bringing home large venison, but also the need for them to stay around was limited. So men are biologically built to be more susceptible to illness and, again, higher risk takers. There are also studies that show men experience pain and illness more severely than women do. Mind body. Okay, but but the bad news is women, because of all these hormones we have coursing through us, we're more susceptible to autoimmune problems. Right. All right, everything is connected. You already heard me pointing to differences coming from the platform of biology. But everything is connected. So the sources of health are all connected. And the body is connected to the mind. What do I mean by mind? Well, I'm not talking about just about brain cells here. I'm talking about the ability to channel thoughts, attention, focus, the cognitive part, the mental life that we all have. The mental ability focus that allowed you to try to shut off the external stimuli when I asked you to focus on your breathing, or to decide that you weren't going to. So that is your inner mental life. We also know some things about our mental life that tie very much into our biological function, as well as the other sources of health. Primarily positive thoughts, what we think, highly correlated with good health. So by thinking ourselves weller, we actually create a weller life experience for ourselves. And there are plenty of studies out there that demonstrate that there are ways to build a stronger mental life. So part of it has to do with focus. There's a big movement toward meditation and mindfulness these days. And a piece of that is response to what we're calling the Vuca environment. Vuca came as a term out of military life. Vuca stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. You see it in the press every once in a while, and it means that the world has gone crazy.
I hit my watch, I'm sorry.
Am I out of time already?
No. It just doesn't. That was Minnie Mouse.
Thank you. Thanks for keep me on target time-wise.
No, I'm going to have my arm away.
I've listed here a few things that the research indicates that you can do to help build your mental life. I've also got a handout for you at the end, and it is a compilation of different skills that we can all work on individually. That's a little exercise I'm going to have you do as a take-home, or suggest to you anyway. But I want to talk about women's minds for just a second. Women show a much higher propensity for health and wellness literacy. Now, what does that mean? It means that we are the keepers of health and wellness in our families. That women are the ones who do the research on what diet is best. That women are the ones who look into what are the different medical treatments that are possible, that who are the practitioners, that how could we be approaching this problem differently. Women are the caretakers. So we show up significantly higher on the mental contribution to figuring out and planning and executing health and wellness. But here is the rub. That same body of research shows that women are often less able to take action based on that. So the challenge to women is to step forward and take a more active, engaged role, because you've got the wherewithal to do it. There's also the issue about positive thinking. Women score significantly higher on their ability and their desire to engage in positive thinking, the inner life of wellness. Well, how does this hit up the next one? The next source of health this touches on is an emotional one, because the piece about positive thinking is also very emotional. And we all have emotional lives as well, right? So what I mean by this are embodied feelings, intuitions, reactions, the part of maybe our mental life and also our inner biology life that is not only in our cognition. Emotional intelligence is something that we measure now. There are different kinds of intelligences. Boy, when I was little, it was just you had an IQ and you were either smart or you weren't smart on the IQ. That's not true anymore. When we look at young people, older people, and we continue to develop our intelligences throughout our lives, there's even a spiritual intelligence. And there are surveys that can be measured. So when we talk about the research on this very frequently, we're talking about how people measure based on these validated, standardized scales. Emotional intelligence is huge. What that means is the ability to read the room and the ability to plan out on almost an intuitive basis how you're going to respond and react to whatever it is that you're sensing. And the capacity for seeing it in a positive and compassionate way. Compassion is huge right now. Probably a lot to do with the last 2 years. We know a lot about compassion, how to measure it, how to describe it, how it interacts with things like mindfulness and charity and mercy. We also know about it with health. A higher level of compassion on those standardized scales reduces anxiety and depression, increases feelings of security and empathy and love, and also mitigates prejudice, anger, and some of the extremist behaviors that we're seeing throughout the world. People who score low on the compassion scales are not the ones who are doing warm and fuzzies all over the world right now. And there are ways to build your emotional intelligence, starting with laughter. So if you've got a favorite comedian that you can plug into on your Netflix, I encourage you to go off and do it. The other thing is to express gratitude in little ways, in big ways, in prayer ways. Practice forgiveness and to cultivate joy in your life. So what's unique about women's emotions? Well, we're higher on the scales for almost all of them. Trust and acceptance, positivity, compassion, and gratitude. Downside, we're also higher on the levels when measured for depression and for anxiety. Emotions connect to the next source of health, which is creativity. Creativity is not just one thing. Creativity turns out to be a whole range of different things. And the way that it's been studied by neuroscientists and social scientists and art teachers over the last several decades has seriously changed. It used to just be one thing was creative or one thing was not creative. Not so anymore. When we go into the library and figure out what we think we know about creativity, turns out there's a big spectrum of things. And it is tied to spirituality in the literature. Now, that's probably a whole other talk as to why it shows up in that branch of the literature, but it does. And in talking about creativity, I often refer to the spirituality research, but I could talk about spirituality by itself because I think it's also an overarching connector, and it shows up in each one of the different sources of health. And I think that's important for this group to recognize, that our connection to a faith-based community and our connection to our own cultivation of spirituality is part of our creativity, part of our source of health. So we know that a higher rating, a higher actualization in creativity is linked to mental health improvements and also linked to overall experiences of wellness. And then there's this whole spectrum of activities and skills that we can do, and you can see how that they're linked into other places. For example, there's research on practicing ritual, which is sort of interesting because it hooks into community, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Writing and journaling, which helps with the mental part, your verbal part of your inner life. Storytelling, which connects us over time as well to community, as well as to self. Drawing, arts and crafts, messy church. Music, dance. All of these things have been measured to help increase creativity. And how do women score differently? Well, you know, I thought that there was this assumption that women are more creative. Well, not so in the literature. It turns out that men actually score higher on creative variability, meaning that they have a bigger range of ways that they can execute creativity, and that much of what we assume is assigned to men or to women is based on societal expectations, that men are just as capable of being highly creative. Look at the great artists of all times, and whether or not they've been men or women. Now, you might say the women were also wonderful artists and they just didn't get noticed as much in the public, but men were certainly out there. If you go to the Sistine Chapel, you will appreciate how that's been going on for some time. Women are consistently more spiritual. On all of the studies that have been done, they've all been ranked to show women significantly more religious, significantly more spiritual, and there's a link between one of our hormones. It's called oxytocin. Oxytocin is very important because, I'll mention this again, it's the tend and befriend hormone. For anyone in the room who's been pregnant, you may have had an oxytocin experience. It is also known as the letdown hormone. It is the one that bonds you to your newborn when that newborn is born. But it has been linked to increased spirituality, and there's even one study that shows that it's linked to a better sex life. Yes, she did say that. So how does oxytocin, which I've got down here in the lower corner, play into the next piece, which is the source of health that's community. Community. Having a meaningful life, having meaningful ties, making contributions back in return, being part of something bigger, a sense of belonging, and mitigating the one single source of health element that is linked to ill health, which is loneliness. It is the one thing that shows up time and time again. Loneliness, why your doctor now, when you go in for your annual physical, asks you what you've been doing with your activities. It's not just pure curiosity. Loneliness now has been attributed to the single most disadvantageous factor, especially as we age. And there's not really good news here for women, by the way, because we age longer, right? Oxytocin. Oxytocin we continue to have as women through our lives, and it's the tend and befriend. It makes us want to be part of community. It makes us get stronger from community. So it works both ways. It draws us to community to begin with, and then, because we're susceptible to being triggered by being in groups like this, it helps increase our oxytocin levels. Oxytocin is a great thing because it is an opiate antagonist, which means that it makes us feel happier. So there are different skills. We establish friendships. We have authentic conversations. We listen. Volunteerism, doing service, women in community. So we're hormonally oriented to tend and befriend, but the bad news is women suffer more from loneliness than do men. Now, part of that is because we live longer. So statistically, remember the data is based on looking at over time, over big populations. We're going to live longer, and we're going to outlive our partners. There's also an increasing trend for women to be divorced or not to marry throughout their life, hence being alone. So loneliness is strongly correlated with ill health, but particularly over age 50. What's interesting here is that widowed men who live longer show up on the surveys in a very comparable way as women. But women are twice as likely to be alone later in life than are men. So we're all doing really good things just by being here. We can congratulate ourselves for that. I want to say something about the bigger picture too, even though I'm not going to talk about this today. It's a whole different talk. But it's called the social determinants of health. And that means that up to this point, everything that I've talked about can be supported or not supported in a systematic way. What I mean by systematic is the infrastructure, governments, the local county, the institutions that we live around can provide us different resources that are external to us. The ones I've been talking about so far are internal to each of us. The ones that are external to us are important for us to be able to thrive. They have to do with the neighborhood that we live in, our healthcare system, our economic stability, our social and community context, our ability to get and continue to get education throughout our life. and of course, our environment. So the final source of health that I'm going to mention has to do with our environment. And by that I mean our greater surroundings. So there are many things that we can do to help support our environment, and that we do. And I've listed a few of them here. What's interesting, I mean, we certainly know that if we've got water that's compromised, if our air quality is poor, if we can't get access in our community to healthy foods, that all of these are environmental factors. But this is the good news for women. Women are more likely to be ecologically minded and also display consistently more pro-environmental behavior. Now, part of that appears to be societal, in that we have more of a family tending role. So things like recycling and turning off the lights frequently fall to the women in the house. But the gender differences are also more pronounced in societies where we have greater resources. And if we're starting that when we're younger, then it leads us down a path of being able to continue to be advocates for that later on. The very last thing all of this feeds into is our life purpose. So whether it comes from tending the environment, tending the community, tending our family, taking care of our creativity, all of those different sources, right smack in the middle of them, is our life purpose. This is actually the big factor in calling up our source of health. I was just listening yesterday to an NPR spot. A researcher from Harvard has just published his new book looking at 7 years of his journals and writing out his own model for his own life purpose. This is engaged much more clearly in different cultures than we do here, but it is showing up in different places, the importance of increasing your sense of why you are here and getting clarity on that and what it's linked to. Overall, longevity studies, longer life, better immunity, lower chronic disease risk, even better wealth if you have a clearer life purpose. And there are different skills to build on your life purpose, everything from coaching to being of service. There's one I want to mention here, especially since our community has suffered a loss this weekend. It's the idea of crucible. One of the things that can breed our life purpose is when we encounter the deep challenges, the challenges that we may say, Lord, let me not go there, and suddenly you find yourself there. Our ability to be able to work through that becomes our crucible. And it can actually elevate our sense of life purpose and give us greater meaning. In Japan, they call this your ikigai. And it's something that's taught to people from the time they're very young. It means from the very beginning, have achievable goals. Instill the idea that life has meaning. Pay attention to what motivates you and what your values are. Draw from your strength and your clarity. And allow that to be the foundation of all the other sources of health that you draw on. And how do women factor into this? Women enjoy higher levels of life purpose. Every study that has measured it. Some of the reason for that is attributed to women being more geared toward altruism. Think about tend and befriend, think about hormones, think about all those sources of places that bring us together, that women are more likely to have altruistic behaviors and attitudes, and then measure significantly higher to engage in reflection and introspection. So this brings us back to what one of my heroes, Carl Rogers, said, is that, and Abraham Maslow, is that we are perpetually capable of becoming better versions of ourselves. And that it all begins with increased self-awareness. So what I've done is I've put together a little bit of a handout for you, and I'd encourage you to take it home, or if you want to take some time and run to the ladies' room or the men's room and fill it out. And on it, I've listed the 7 sources of health that I've talked about today. There's no perfect measure, but just in your intuitive response, you might want to say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 7, where am I on each of these? And then, while you're thinking about it, note down where you are a star. Where do you shine? And note down what you've always wanted to try, whether it be belly dancing, or learning how to do aerobic, or possibly doing inversions on the yoga balance beam. And make notes for yourself now while you're thinking about it. Because an empty lantern provides no light. Self-care is the fuel that allows your light to shine brightly. Thank you.